the complete story of Jack the Ripper. Welcome to Dark History Files, where the shadows of the past come to life. Tonight, we take you on a journey into one of the darkest and most terrifying mysteries in history, the legend of Jack the Ripper. This name, uttered in whispers by those who dared speak of it, still sends shivers down the spine over a century later. A figure that emerged from the fog-shrouded streets of Whitechapel, an area teeming with the impoverished and desperate. Jack the Ripper left behind nothing but blood, fear, and unanswered questions. But who was Jack the Ripper? Was he a well-educated doctor, hidden behind a mask of respectability? Could he have been a butcher, using his trade as a cover for something far more sinister? Or was he something darker still? An entity that thrived on fear, a phantom who stalked his prey with a chilling, almost supernatural precision. Some say he was a shadow, a mere figment of the night, slipping through the cracks of society like a ghost, leaving terror in his wake. In the dense fog of Victorian London, his presence was everywhere and nowhere at once. Each of his killings was not just a murder but an intricate display of cruelty, an enigma wrapped in terror, drawing the authorities and public into an obsession with identifying a faceless predator. But what if the truth is darker than we can imagine? What if the monster lurking in Whitechapel wasn't a man at all, but something far more malevolent? As we peel back the layers of this gruesome tale, we invite you to follow us into the heart of darkness. Keep your eyes wide, because in the shadows, the truth may be more terrifying than the legend itself. Are you ready to uncover the horrifying reality behind Jack the Ripper's reign of terror? If you dare, join us on a journey that will leave you questioning not just the killer's identity, but the very nature of evil itself. A shadow emerges, the birth of a legend. The true identity of Jack the Ripper is a ghost, forever lost in the dense fog of history. Who was the man, or monster, who haunted the streets of Whitechapel in 1888, leaving a trail of brutality and terror? Over a century later, his name still lingers in the dark corners of criminal history, unsolved, untouchable. The Ripper is a name that has evolved from a simple moniker into a symbol of terror, a chilling embodiment of the unknown. What makes this case so compelling and terrifying is that his true identity remains an enigma, a shadow that slips through the cracks of time. There are theories, many of them, but none have ever definitively unmasked him. Could he have been a man with knowledge so unsettling it bordered on the grotesque? Criminologists and historians alike speculate that Jack the Ripper must have had an unsettling familiarity with anatomy, a chilling understanding of the human body that allowed him to disembowel his victims with terrifying precision. The way he removed organs, the surgical skill exhibited in his mutilations, suggests that he wasn't a mere common criminal. Was he a doctor, someone trained in the delicate arts of medicine and anatomy? A surgeon, perhaps, who, for reasons unknown, became addicted to the act of violence, blending his medical expertise with a dark and twisted desire? Alternatively, the Ripper could have been a butcher, someone who worked with flesh every day, perhaps in a trade that exposed him to the raw, visceral elements of human anatomy. Butcher or surgeon, the precision of his cuts suggests that these killings were anything but random. They were deliberate, calculated, with a chilling method behind each murder. His actions weren't born of spur-of-the-moment anger or passion. They were the actions of a mind that seemed to be working towards something, a plan that remained forever out of reach. It's as if he viewed his victims not as people, but as puzzles to be solved or experiments to be conducted. Could the Ripper have been someone with an agenda even darker than a simple desire to kill? A mind obsessed with fear, control, and blood? Maybe he wasn't just a man. It's possible he was a force, a shadow that lurked in the darkness with no discernible goal other than to sow chaos, confusion, and terror. Perhaps he saw his victims not as human beings at all, but as vessels, objects to be manipulated, disfigured, and discarded in a grotesque display of dominance and power. The Ripper's motivation was never fully understood, but it was certainly something more than just bloodlust. Every aspect of his crimes seemed to be calculated, every move steeped in mystery. Why did he target these particular women? Vulnerable, often sex workers walking the dark streets at night. What drove him to choose such grotesque and almost artistic methods of mutilation? And why, After 5 murders, did he suddenly vanish into the night, leaving a city of frightened citizens and frustrated authorities behind? The killer became an idea, a symbol, a phantom who remained just out of reach, a shadow who refused to reveal his true nature. Who was the man that embodied this shadow? Was he merely human? Or was he a monstrous creation of fear, hatred, and obsession? A figure whose very existence continues to baffle the world to this day? The question remains unanswered, and it is this mystery, the unknown, the unsolved, that has kept the legend of Jack the Ripper alive, haunting us with the chilling possibility that sometimes the shadows are all we'll ever have. The Whitechapel murders, a city in fear. From August to November 1888, the fog-filled streets of Whitechapel became the stage for a series of horrific crimes that would forever change the face of London. The district was already known for its squalor, poverty, and overcrowding, a place where the vulnerable and destitute struggled to survive. But nothing could have prepared the residents of this impoverished area for the terror that would descend upon them when a faceless predator began his gruesome spree. The killer, who would later become known as Jack the Ripper, didn't just kill. He dismantled lives with such precision and brutality that even the most hardened detectives were shaken. The women who became his victims were often marginalized members of society, many of whom were prostitutes trying to survive in a world that had little empathy for their plight. Each victim was left to die alone in the night, their fates intertwined with the dark underbelly of London's most dangerous streets. The murders were not only an assault on the victims' bodies, but also on their humanity. These were not just nameless women. Each had a life, a story. Yet, in death, they became symbols of a terrifying mystery that still captivates the world to this day. The canonical 5 victims, those most commonly linked to the Ripper's killing spree, are as follows. Mary Ann Polly Nichols, August 31st, 1888. Polly Nichols was 43 years old, a woman whose life had already been marred by hardship and tragedy. Once married with children, Polly had fallen into the depths of poverty after a failed marriage. By the time of her death, she was a prostitute, known to frequent the streets of Whitechapel in search of clients to survive. She was the first to fall victim to the Ripper's horrific methods. Her body was discovered in Buck's Row, her throat slashed so deeply that her carotid artery was severed, and her abdomen was mutilated with an almost surgical precision. The brutality of her death shocked the public, signaling the beginning of a reign of terror that would send waves of fear through the city. Annie Chapman, September 8, 1888. Annie Chapman, 47 years old, had a similarly tragic history. A former flower seller, Annie had been married to a man who died of alcoholism, leaving her destitute and dependent on the streets for survival. Her murder, which took place at 29 Hanbury Street, showed signs of terrifying precision. Annie's throat was slashed, but it was the removal of her organs that struck investigators as particularly horrifying. It appeared that her murderer had anatomical knowledge, removing her uterus with disturbing skill. Witnesses reported hearing a struggle just moments before her body was found, leading some to speculate that the killer was interrupted during the act. This only heightened the sense of fear and urgency. Had he been disturbed, or was this part of his twisted game? Elizabeth Stride, September 30th, 1888. Elizabeth Stride, 44 years old, had immigrated from Sweden in search of a better life. But she too had fallen into the harsh reality of poverty and prostitution in London. Her death, on Berner Street, is one of the most puzzling. Unlike the other victims, Elizabeth's body was found with only one deep throat wound. Her body was left relatively intact, leading to the chilling theory that the killer had been interrupted before he could finish his gruesome work. Some believe that he was startled by a passing witness or perhaps even law enforcement, but whatever the reason, it suggested a growing desperation within the killer. He had not only failed to finish his work, but the attack itself had been cut short, leaving behind a sense of unfinished business. Catherine Eddowes, September 30th, 1888. Just hours after Stride's death, the killer struck again. Catherine Eddowes, 46 years old, was found in Mitre Square, her body mutilated with an intensity that matched the previous killings. Her face had been slashed, and her abdomen was opened, with her kidney removed. Eddowes was a woman of many struggles. including alcoholism and a troubled history with her family. Unlike the previous victims, she had been in the company of a man shortly before her murder, and some believe this might have contributed to the killer's desperation. Edow's death is particularly chilling because it happened on the same night as Stride's murder, suggesting that the killer was not only bold but brazen, driven by an insatiable thirst for violence. Was he growing more reckless, or was there a specific reason for this sudden frenzy of murder? Mary Jane Kelly, November 9, 1888. The final and most brutal of the Ripper's victims was Mary Jane Kelly, just 25 years old at the time of her death. Mary Jane's life was a tragic one. Though much less was known about her, it's clear that she, too, had turned to prostitution to survive. She was found in her own room at Miller's Court, and her murder was unlike any of the others. The violence inflicted on her was unspeakable. Her body was so savagely mutilated that it was nearly unrecognizable. The Ripper had all the time he needed in the privacy of her room, and he used it to perform horrific acts of dismemberment. Her murder marked the end of the killing spree, but it also left the police with more questions than answers. Was this final act a display of the Ripper's growing madness, or was it the culmination of his sickening obsession with control and power? The lives of these women, so often overshadowed by their tragic end, were filled with pain, resilience, and untold stories. Yet in death, they became symbols of the horror that Jack the Ripper left in his wake. Each victim represented more than just a statistic in a gruesome case. They were real people, with histories and futures snuffed out by a faceless killer. These deaths were not just brutal murders. They were carefully constructed, almost artistic acts of terror designed to shock, paralyze, and instill a lasting fear in a city already teetering on the edge. Each woman was a victim, but they were also much more. A reminder of the lives lost, of the darkness that consumed them, and the terror that still looms over Whitechapel today. These were the women who gave their lives to a legend, and in doing so, they became part of a story that still haunts the world. The Ripper's signature, a grim modus operandi. Jack the Ripper's killings weren't just acts of violence. They were meticulously crafted, calculated performances of terror that followed a grim and horrifyingly consistent pattern. Every detail of his murders seemed designed to strike fear into the hearts of the public, and to leave behind a chilling signature that would haunt both the authorities and the citizens of London for generations. The most unsettling aspect of the Ripper's modus operandi was its precision. His victims, always women, often sex workers, were chosen for their vulnerability. They were typically alone, walking the dimly lit streets of Whitechapel late at night, a time when the shadows offered both solace and danger. The killer knew that these women, who lived on the margins of society, would be far less likely to be missed until it was too late. His attacks were swift and brutal, but there was something deeply methodical about them, as if the Ripper was not simply taking lives but orchestrating a macabre ritual. The quick, merciless slaying. The first strike of the Ripper's blade was always the same: deep, swift cuts to the throat. This was no crime of passion. The Ripper's attacks were executed with cold, efficient precision. His goal was clear: to silence his victims immediately. The deep gash to the throat severed not only the airways but also the life force of his victims, rendering them unable to cry out for help. In the eerie quiet of the night, the Ripper could strike without fear of drawing attention or attracting witnesses. The speed and efficiency of the killings suggest a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Each blow intended to silence the scream of the woman before he began his grotesque work. But what makes this even more chilling is the way he would often leave his victims to die alone. Their throats severed so cleanly, it was as if he sought to maintain an unearthly stillness, a perfect calm amidst the horror. The precision of mutilation. The disfigurement of his victims' bodies was not a mindless act of rage, but something far more sinister, a signature of chilling expertise. Each of the Ripper's victims was left in a state of grotesque mutilation, their bodies torn open with an eerie anatomical precision. The removal of organs, such as kidneys, uteri, or parts of the intestines, was not for any clear practical reason. There was no sign of theft or robbery, and no sexual assault. The mutilations were personal, carried out with an unsettling understanding of human anatomy. This raised a terrifying question. Did the Ripper have knowledge of dissection, or even medical training? His surgical skill left investigators baffled and terrified, as it was clear that this wasn't the work of a common criminal. Was this an act of bloodlust, or was there a deeper, darker purpose behind the disfigurements? Perhaps the Ripper was driven by an obsession with the human body, a twisted compulsion to study and control life and death in ways that most of us cannot fathom. The missing organs, a dark agenda. The missing organs from the victims were one of the most chilling aspects of the murders. These weren't typical acts of violence committed in a fit of rage or sexual frenzy. There was a cold, deliberate purpose behind the mutilations. Sometimes, the organs were removed with such precision that it suggested a deeper, unexplainable need. What was the Ripper doing with the organs? Did he have a grotesque purpose for collecting them? The fact that the organs were taken without any apparent motive for theft or exploitation hints at something far darker. Was the Ripper driven by a desire to understand the human body in a twisted way? Or was he engaged in a ritualistic act, perhaps an attempt to take ownership of his victims, to control them even in death? The removal of these organs led to more questions than answers, leaving experts to wonder. What could possibly drive a man to commit such horrific, calculated acts? Was this a compulsion that went beyond mere killing? Was it an obsession with death itself, a desire to wield the power of life and death in his hands? The satisfaction of the kill. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Ripper's signature was not just the brutal killings, but the apparent satisfaction he derived from them. The way he left his victims in such an atrocious state, the way he had seemingly mastered the art of terror, there was something deeply disturbing in his apparent joy at the violence he inflicted. The very act of watching his victims bleed out, their lives drained in cold, calculated silence, suggests a deep satisfaction, not from a need for wealth, revenge, or sexual release, but from a darker, more primal source. Was the Ripper deriving pleasure from the fear he created? Was the act of killing a way to exert control over his victims, and perhaps even over the world around him? The more we ask about his motives, the more the answers elude us, creating a nightmarish puzzle that seems to be without resolution. His killings weren't just about blood. They were about terror, about a power over life and death that we still can't fully comprehend. In summary, the Ripper's methodical approach to murder, a swift strike to silence, followed by grotesque mutilation, was not the work of a common criminal, but the signature of a man with a chilling purpose. His actions seemed to transcend simple bloodlust, hinting at a deeper, more disturbing need. The lack of clear motive or satisfaction from any obvious means, be it financial gain or sexual gratification, adds to the mystery of his identity and his twisted agenda. Was he a man driven by an insatiable thirst for power, control, or an obsession with the human body? Whatever the truth, the Ripper's signature remains a grim reminder of the terror he brought to Whitechapel and the dark, unanswered questions he left behind. The investigation and police desperation. As the terror of Jack the Ripper's reign continued, Whitechapel was paralyzed by fear, its residents cowering in the shadows while the killer stalked the streets. The London police, led by Scotland Yard, launched an extensive and relentless investigation, but despite their best efforts, they found themselves ensnared in a terrifying cat-and-mouse game with a predator they could not catch. From the moment the first body was discovered, the police threw every resource they could muster into the search for the murderer. They deployed officers to patrol Whitechapel's dark, foggy streets, question witnesses, and followed leads that seemed to lead nowhere. Investigators conducted extensive door-to-door inquiries, questioned suspects, and combed the streets for any trace of the Ripper's identity. But the more they tried to close in on the killer, the more elusive he became, slipping through their grasp as if he were a shadow, untouchable and invisible. Despite this mounting pressure, the killer was always one step ahead. He seemed to know exactly when and where to strike, and just as the police thought they were getting closer, he would vanish into the mist, leaving behind nothing but blood and terror. This eerie ability to evade capture led to frustration among investigators, who found themselves increasingly desperate as the case went cold. Even with the brightest minds working tirelessly to solve the mystery, they remained baffled by the Ripper's ability to slip through their fingers time and again. The killer's unpredictability made him even more terrifying. He could strike anywhere, at any time, and then disappear without a trace. For the police, it was a nightmare they couldn't escape. As the case stretched on, the Ripper seemed to delight in his elusiveness. This is where the infamous letters began to arrive. The letters, a sick game of taunting. Among the most disturbing elements of the investigation were the letters that began to flood the offices of the police and local newspapers. These letters, many of which were dismissed as hoaxes or the work of a sick, twisted mind, contributed to the growing sense of fear and confusion. The authorities were faced with a barrage of correspondence, some of which were clearly crude pranks, meant to inflame public hysteria or profit from the media circus surrounding the case. But one letter stood apart from the rest, an envelope postmarked "From Hell." The "From Hell" letter arrived on October 16, 1888, addressed to George Lusk, a leader of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. Inside was a gruesome surprise, a human kidney. The letter itself was brief, but its contents were shocking in their brutality. "From Hell. Mr. Lusk, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman and preserved it for you. The other half I fried and ate it. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out, if you only wait a while longer." The letter was signed, Jack the Ripper, and it sent shockwaves through the city. Was this a prank? Or was the Ripper taunting the police and the public with an unthinkable act of cruelty? The inclusion of the kidney, along with the chillingly matter-of-fact tone of the letter, suggested that this was no ordinary criminal. It was a man who was enjoying the terror he created. The fact that he was willing to go so far as to send a piece of human organ to the authorities only heightened the suspicion that he was playing a sick game, mocking the police for their inability to catch him. The kidney in the letter was carefully examined, but forensic science in 1888 was not as advanced as it is today. Despite the gruesome evidence, the letter did little to aid the investigation. What it did do, however, was further deepen the paranoia and fear that had already taken hold of the city. The Ripper's ability to so freely taunt the police and media was unsettling. It suggested that he was enjoying the fear he had created, and perhaps even gaining a perverse sense of power from watching the authorities scramble in desperation. He was playing with them, like a cat with a trapped mouse. Media frenzy and public paranoia. The "From Hell" letter wasn't the only one. In fact, numerous other letters, signed by Jack the Ripper, were sent to newspapers and the police throughout the autumn of 1888. Some of these letters were laughable in their amateurishness, while others contained more chilling and cryptic messages. The public, already on edge from the horrific murders, was gripped by a mixture of fear and fascination with the killer's correspondence. The media stoked the flames of this paranoia, sensationalizing every letter and every new development in the case. The public became obsessed with the mystery, fueling an atmosphere of hysteria that spread through London like wildfire. The letters served as a twisted form of communication from the killer to the world, a means of asserting control, of watching the chaos he had created, and perhaps of taunting both the police and the public. The fact that the killer was engaging in this bizarre form of communication only added to the sense of helplessness and frustration felt by the police. He was playing a game they couldn't win, and it was becoming increasingly clear that he was enjoying every minute of it. At the same time, the media coverage of the murders was creating a feeding frenzy of speculation, rumor, and fear. The newspapers printed sensational headlines, feeding into the growing hysteria and paranoia that gripped London. Every day brought a new story, a new theory, a new suspect, and this only further distracted the police from finding the real killer. The press often amplified the fear, publishing stories of potential suspects who were later proven to be innocent, while further cementing the idea of a faceless, invisible monster lurking in the shadows of Whitechapel. The Ripper's enduring power. As the investigation continued to stall, it became increasingly clear that the Ripper's power lay not just in his ability to evade capture, but in the fear he was able to instill in the city. The police were desperate, and the public was terrified. Yet the killer seemed to delight in watching it all unfold. His presence loomed over London like a dark specter, and with every letter, every murder, every whisper of a new suspect, he continued to tighten his grip on the city. Was Jack the Ripper enjoying the panic he had caused? Was he using the media frenzy as a weapon to further his own dark amusement? What we do know is that the letters and the ongoing media storm only deepened the sense of despair and helplessness that consumed both the police and the people of London. The case was slipping away from them, and the killer, whether enjoying the fear or driven by something even darker, remained free, watching from the shadows. In summary, the investigation into Jack the Ripper's crimes became a tragic tale of frustration and failure, as Scotland Yard found themselves outsmarted by a killer who seemed to anticipate their every move. The arrival of the infamous From Hell letter only added to the sense of dread and helplessness that had already gripped the city. With the media fueling paranoia and the killer remaining elusive, the case spiraled into a macabre game of cat and mouse, one in which the Ripper remained the undisputed victor. A legacy of fear and mystery. Jack the Ripper may have disappeared into the shadows over a century ago, but his legacy continues to cast a long, unsettling shadow over both history and popular culture. The terror he unleashed in the impoverished streets of Whitechapel, London, left a scar on the collective consciousness, and his name has become synonymous with unspeakable evil. His story transcends time, not just as a case of gruesome murder, but as a symbol of an unsolved enigma that continues to intrigue, disturb, and haunt generations. Even though his crimes ended in November of 1888, the mystery surrounding his identity, motives, and nature remains unresolved. His brutal killings, combined with his apparent ability to slip away into the night, have made him a figure of legend. The question of who Jack the Ripper truly was remains one of the most perplexing in criminal history, an open wound that no amount of investigation, theory, or speculation has been able to heal. For over a century, countless theories have emerged, each offering a different possible identity for the killer, but none have been proven. From famous suspects like the artist Walter Sickert to more fringe theories about royal conspiracies, every potential solution has only deepened the mystery. Jack the Ripper's actions were not just heinous acts of violence. They were a grotesque form of defiance against the world. He mocked the authorities, taunted the public, and left behind a trail of terror that created a sense of helplessness. His ability to commit such brutal acts without being caught, and the fact that the murders stopped as abruptly as they had begun, turned him into more than a criminal. He became a symbol of chaos and unpredictability. In this sense, his legacy is not just about the terror he instilled, but about the unanswered questions that have kept his name alive. The cultural impact, a figure of fascination. While the murders themselves were horrifying, Jack the Ripper's legacy was cemented not just in the gruesome details of the crimes, but in the way his story has been reimagined, adapted, and explored in various forms of media. From books and films to documentaries and television shows, the story of Jack the Ripper has become a staple of both true crime and horror genres. The first significant fictional work inspired by the murders came soon after the killings themselves, with various novels, plays, and even poetry referencing the Ripper's reign of terror. Some early books speculated on his identity, while others sought to explore the macabre fascination the killer invoked. Over time, as the decades passed, Jack the Ripper became a staple of popular culture. In particular, the Victorian setting and the mysterious nature of the killer have been used in countless films, TV shows, and novels, cementing his place as a figure of both horror and intrigue. Yet, despite the number of fictionalized portrayals, something remains chillingly real about Jack the Ripper. The story has taken on a life of its own, inspiring walking tours of Whitechapel, museums dedicated to his legacy, and even real-life investigations that continue to this day. The lure of the unsolved mystery, combined with the brutality of the crimes, has ensured that Jack the Ripper remains a figure not just of historical interest, but of ongoing obsession. The impact on criminology and forensic science. Jack the Ripper's crimes left an indelible mark on modern criminology and forensic science. The inability to catch the Ripper despite the extensive investigation led to important changes in investigative practices. Though the case went unsolved, it prompted law enforcement and criminal investigators to adopt more systematic methods, including better record-keeping, the use of forensic evidence, and psychological profiling. At the time of the Ripper murders, forensic science was in its infancy, but the grisly nature of the crimes would inspire future detectives and criminologists to develop more advanced methods for solving similar cases. The Ripper's ability to evade capture showed just how crucial it was to understand not only the methods of the criminal, but also the psychology behind them. His crimes set the stage for future criminal investigations, influencing the development of criminal profiling as a tool for identifying and understanding serial killers. Additionally, the case sparked the evolution of forensic pathology, as detectives and medical examiners began to focus more on the analysis of wounds, autopsies, and the potential for forensic evidence that could be used to link crimes together. Although the technologies available at the time were limited, the Ripper case marked a turning point, and many of the techniques that are now standard in criminal investigations can trace their origins back to this harrowing chapter in history. The enduring mystery: why did he kill? More than a century after the murders, the question that still haunts investigators and the public alike is, why did Jack the Ripper kill? What drove this seemingly ordinary man, if he even was an ordinary man, to commit such grotesque acts? Was it a compulsion? A deeply rooted psychological disorder? A need for power, control, or revenge? Or perhaps it was something more chilling, a manifestation of evil itself, lurking in the darkest corners of the human psyche. Over the years, various theories have emerged, trying to explain his motivations, but none have succeeded in providing a definitive answer. His pattern of targeting vulnerable women, often prostitutes, and his apparent surgical precision point to a mind that was not just focused on killing, but on tormenting and mutilating. Some believe that he had a specific agenda, perhaps related to social, psychological, or sexual motivations. Others argue that his motives were far darker and more irrational, suggesting that the Ripper was a figure driven by an insatiable, inexplicable thirst for blood. The true reasons behind his killings may never be known, but the mystery has ensured that his name will never fade from the annals of criminal history. A darker legacy, a phantom that lingers. While Jack the Ripper's crimes ended over 130 years ago, the lingering legacy of his terror continues to shape both history and criminal investigations. He was not just a murderer. He was an enigma, a shadow that has never fully dissipated. His legacy is one of fear, fascination, and unsolved mystery, a dark phantom that continues to haunt the streets of Whitechapel and the minds of those who seek to understand him. Though his name has become synonymous with horror, the real terror of Jack the Ripper is that he remains, in many ways, as elusive and terrifying as ever. His identity may never be revealed, but his place in the dark corners of history is secure, a reminder that sometimes the most chilling truths are the ones that remain hidden. Thank you for joining us tonight on Dark History Files. If you found yourself entranced by this journey into one of history's darkest tales, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Remember, history is far darker than we can imagine. Keep your eyes on the shadows. Until next time.